Sorry to the one person watching. We had a technical difficulty that ended in the death of the last stream. And I assume in a couple seconds people will join into this one. So just let people rejoin. Okay, good. People are flocking to the new stream. So that is what happens if you do a 2-fingered swipe instead of a 3-fingered swipe, and then your entire live stream decides to destroy itself. So welcome back, everyone. As I was explaining, if you have any, am I a new conservative voter? You are not a. I don't know if you're a debater. No, I'm not a new conservative voter. I would not vote for new conservative. My political opinions do not represent the University of Auckland Debating Society. So jumping back onto what we were discussing, and once again, if you have any questions, not relevant to whether or not I vote New Conservative, but relevant to how you set up points, just flick them in. So we've discussed substantive points. What we're going to do now is jump over and discuss rebuttal points. So essentially, rebuttal points, note, are not going to be used by every speaker, and in fact most of the time I think they should be confined to people who are first response positions, so first negating or second affirming. And the reason I caution against using rebuttal points very widely is because you are going to be giving new responses and engaging with other people's material throughout all of your points, and it shouldn't just be confined to one small part of your speech. However, sometimes it is good, generally at the beginning of your speech, to have a rebuttal section, and that's where you go quite quickly through particular points that don't really seem to fit into the rest of your case. Say, for example, someone has brought up, a second speaker has brought up a brand new point about a new stakeholder that you don't think is worth enough to devote a huge amount of time or energy integrating into the rest of the case, and you think can be dealt with quite quickly. You're going to want to deal with it when you're in your rebuttal section. So how do you set up a rebuttal point, even if you're not going to be using it particularly often and only for stuff that doesn't fit into the rest of your case? The way I tend to set it up is I first say, what is the point that they have made? So try to be generous. Sometimes people will make points badly, but later speakers will clean it up, so you want to be engaging with the best version of that point that is reasonable from what they've said, and you want to give a clear indication of the extent and limitations of the point. So you'll be like, they said that people are going to die that are innocent with the death penalty, and that this is something that is bad. You then just need to headline your responses to that. So you just in a brief manner. Remember, rebuttal points should always be kept very brief. If it's not important enough to be integrated into the rest of your case and the rest of the issues that you talk about, it probably isn't important enough to devote like a huge amount of time to. Just give those headline responses. Say, it's not important either on a framework basis, so say, even if it is true, we don't particularly care for these reasons, we don't think it fits within our framework, and then go through the logic of it and try to unpick it. And this tends to be the inverse of the substantive mechanisms that I was talking about. When you're building substantive mechanisms, it's all about building those layers to make sure that links can't be taken apart. When you're doing a rebuttal section, it's kind of the inverse. So you go through and you try and pull out each individual link, and then explain what pulling that link out means for their case. And so if you are listening to the speaker in front of you, you don't just need to be listening to the headlines of their points. Be quite attentive to how they set up their points, where they spend their time in setting up their points, because often it can reveal their hand a little bit. It can show you where they think the point is weak, and then when you respond to the point by pulling out that particular link, by say, for example, it's not true that the police are racist, therefore it's not true that it is overwhelmingly African Americans or Māori people who would be on the receiving ends of this, you then need to explain what the effect of pulling that link out is. So if you are able to prove that the police aren't racist, we're able to prove that the point doesn't affect anyone. So make sure you have that two-step process, what they're wrong about or what assumption that they've made is wrong, and then how that affects the logic of their case. And then remember, just as in a substantive mechanism, you need to be setting things up in an even-if way, setting up things in a thorough mechanistic way that goes down the layers. also do that for your rebuttal points. Say, even if they're able to prove this part of their point, they're unable to prove these other 3 parts, therefore the mechanism still collapses. Even if they're able to prove 3 of the 4, even like losing the 4th assumption means that the point doesn't logically follow. Even if they're able to prove the point altogether, here's how it doesn't fit into the framework by which you should judge the debate, therefore we shouldn't give it much importance. Very good debaters are good at not just engaging with their best case scenario, where they're able to knock out all of the different points from the opposition, but walk the judge through what happens even if they're not able to win each clear part of the point, but just holistically are able to do damage to it, or able to make it minimal and wait it out of the debate. So those are the 2 most common types of points, and I'm going to just jump to the anonymous questions and see if anyone's flicked through any. And yep, so we've got a couple of questions relating to substantive and rebuttal points. The first is, what are some good questions you can ask to determine what the context of your point is? So what I like to think of in terms of what questions I ask myself in determining the context of the point, it's the broad assumptions about the world that are necessary for the point to operate. So say, for example, you're doing a debate about how, like whaling, for example, and you want to explain that whaling is particularly harmed to whale species. The context point will be very important there if you're making a point, say, for example, about pain, because that's a lot of the proving about the world that you need to do. You need to be like, whales are mammals just like us, they feel pain, they have emotions, and so doing things that are bad to them is something that is a morally bad thing to do. So the first bit of that statement that I made are the context part of the statement, because I want to prove something about the world, that whales feel pain, that whales are mammals, that like those broad ideas behind the point actually working, and then the mechanism for that point is actually quite simple, because if you assume the context there, then the mechanism of killing whales being a bad thing is something that follows very neatly from that, and then you go on to impacting that and explaining how it should weigh into the debate. So I don't think there's necessarily a clear, concise answer to what is the context, what is the mechanism. It's really just asking yourself, what do I need the judge to believe in order for this point, in order for the mechanism I explain to functionally operate? And there'll be a lot of crossover there. When you're making complex points, you'll be adding bits of context as you go through the mechanism, if it's like a complex multi-part mechanism, but it's basically the knowledge that they need in order for the logical links you are making to make sense. So the second question is tips for integrating rebuttal, particularly how to set out your notes for it. And this is, I think, a very good question, because it picks up on what I was telling you about the limited usefulness of rebuttal points. Rebuttal points should only be when something isn't able to be integrated, doesn't fit into the rest of the framework of the debate, but you still feel the need to deal with it and knock it out of the debate. So in terms of integrating your rebuttal, when you are a second or a third speaker, or even a first AF speaker, what you're looking for is themes within the debate. And I tend to think of these themes as particular goals within the debate. I want to achieve this outcome, I want to achieve this outcome, I want to achieve this outcome. All these outcomes help me win the debate. You tend to group your points as to what is able to achieve that particular outcome, be it justice, be it like helping like more people in a utilitarian way, and then figuring out and then grouping your points like that. So when you're integrating your rebuttal, and I'll talk a lot about this when we get to the issues, the issue type of point, especially when you're taking notes, what you want to do is to have a clear understanding within your notes of what you stand for. What have the speakers ahead of you said within the debate, and what have you said is going to flow on from that? So when you're integrating your rebuttal, you want to make sure that you have very clear understanding of your points, very clear understanding of how they've responded to it, and then the flow on approach beneath that. So setting it out on your paper, at the top of your paper, you'll have what are we arguing about, what do we need to achieve. You'll have the names of the responses that they're going to give, or that they have given to that, or the points that you need to defeat to win that overall outcome. And then you can have multiple pieces of paper flowing off that. I'm quite a paper minimalist, so what I'll tend to do is just bullet point within it. Okay, they've said this thing, and this thing in relation to the outcome that we're competing over, which has become the body of my issue. And then just underneath it being like, firstly, have we already responded to it? So does this link into something that my previous speaker said, and that defeats it? And then just having my arguments beneath it. But I know some other speakers, especially when they're third speakers and they've got lots to deal with in the debate, are kind of grouping their paper and their notes in terms of I've got this broad issue I care about, and then I've got lots of sub-issues in it, and I'll basically have one piece of paper per sub-issue, and then you just slot the rebuttal into each piece of paper. And you might find that a more helpful way to set up the integration of your rebuttal, but often it really is just about giving yourself space on your paper, making sure you have room to write in, and then you can always just be adding notes or adding pieces of feedback or pieces of rebuttal that you think are important. Any hacks for context when you are dumb and don't read the news? Well, very luckily, you have normally two teammates, or at least one teammate, who hopefully isn't a dum-dum and has done their general reading. So what you need to do there is, A, firstly just lean on your partners, but B, context is not just about knowing things about the world. Normally it is just about knowing a couple of things and then being able to flesh them out that are important to proving the end of your points. And at some times, like, there will be a limit of your knowledge, and then the context you can give just gets shrunk a little bit, and you have to do a little bit more work in your mechanism. You have to draw more analogies, you have to try and ground your material in another way, because you don't have those assumptions you can rest on, and those assumptions that you can share. Neat. Okay, so what we're going to do now, and I've already spoken about it a little bit, is jump to the third, probably most common type of point, and that is an issue or a clash point. And essentially, as a second speaker, I almost entirely switch my structure to being like a third speaker, so I normally speak about the debate in issues or clashes already, so it's a very useful skill to know. And I think the first question that I answered in relation to integrating rebuttal, and the discussion we had there about how you pick the issues, being what are the outcomes you want in the debate, what are the bits of the debate that are necessarily to be proven independently in order to contribute to the outcome, to the overall result that you want, is quite relevant here. So after you've decided what your issues and clashes are going to be, you then need to break it down into several sections of how you approach in a thorough way making these arguments. And what I would caution here is it does change a little bit with the complexity level of the arguments at the point where you've introduced yourself to the debate. Because obviously if you're a second speaker, sometimes the points are a little bit clearer in terms of how they are set up, so you just need to do a more thorough job, making sure you respond to each and everything, whereas if you are a third speaker, you're doing a little bit more of a prioritization role. So you're thinking about, like, okay, there's lots of messy things been set out within the debate, how do I then group these into, like, coherent patterns of thought that I can then swing one way or the other? So the way at second I set up my issues and clashes is the first thing you do is to be very clear about what you stand for or what you told you. So the first thing I'll say will always be at my first speaker, like at Zach, at Joe, at any of the people who might speak in front of me. We told you this thing. So what is the outcome that I told you were going to get, and how did I tell you were going to get there? Because it's important both to have the impact that you want and the mechanism that you want, because these are both things that are going to be challenged or contested by the opposition team. I make that quite brief because it's not about remaking the points. In your issues, you don't want to be remaking points that have already been made. It's just about reminding the judge what are the particular bits of analysis that came before you that are relevant to winning this particular issue or clash. The second thing I do is I have a section that speaks about how they responded to what we brought you. So say we brought you an excellent argument about why we shouldn't kill whales because whales are sentient and whales feel pain, and they responded by saying, no, our moral community is something that is entirely different, therefore whales shouldn't be included in that, or we should prioritize humans. So when you are putting out how they responded, it's important to consider what this response actually does within the debate. Is it attacking the framework that you've set up? Is it attacking the comparative that you've set up? Is it attacking the logic within your points? What exactly is it doing? So when I'm responding to the various responses that I've put out, the first thing that I ask is, what does this point respond to? And then if they have entirely proved it, what hasn't it done? Because oftentimes, particularly some countries from overseas, what they'll do is they'll give you a huge amount of rebuttal, and they won't really explain what that rebuttal deals with, and if you end up sifting through all that rebuttal, you'll find that your case sometimes just still exists, but judges can get confused because there's so much rebuttal and think that they've been able to disprove your point. So often, the first thing to do when you're responding to, in an issue, a bit of responsiveness that you've had from the opposition team, is just to explain how effective it is at best. So say, even if this is true, it is only mitigatory. Here's how much of our case survives if you accept that everything you say is true. And if you are able to stand up and be like, well, if this thing, and this thing, the three responses they gave you are true, and they still haven't been able to knock out our point, that really boosts in the judge's mind what you've been able to accomplish and makes it harder for them to then come in later within the debate and try and undercut it using that same mechanisms. So ask yourself what survives, what is the impact of their responses to it, is it able to function? The second layer is saying, well, it's not going to be true, because normally the teams that you are debating against will be doing just what you're doing and trying to shift facts one way or the other, or tell strategic untruths to try and win the debate. So you just have to go through the problems of that analysis. And often that relies on comparing two worlds. So the comparative, so saying like, this is what they've set up as the comparative, we think they've misidentified it, we think that the world that they've set up isn't believable, dealing with that comparative and then those contextual questions. Sometimes it'll be about the logic of the points, so they'll be like, this assumption is true and this assumption is true, and you'll agree that both of those assumptions are true, but you won't agree with their conclusion from it. So drawing the line being like, hey, 1 + 1 doesn't actually equal 3, so going through the logic, and then sometimes it'll be about the assertions that they make. So instead of being like, well, the conclusion doesn't follow, the conclusion would follow if both of their premises were true, but one of the premises that is necessary to prove the point isn't true. So this is the same process we went through of the rebuttal, just applied to a different thing. And I actually think the line between rebuttal and non-rebuttal is slightly an artificial one, because at its core, when you're rebutting a point, you're trying to assert a different reality. You are trying to tell them that something else has happened, which is actually basically a point in and of itself. So the way that you deal with responding to their responses and just responding to their points in general isn't actually hugely different. It's just how much time you put into it, how much effort you put into it. The last two ways in which I think you can respond when breaking down an issue that are important is when you can point out how something is contradictory, and normally this is very useful. It doesn't win you the debate to point out the opposition has contradicted itself, but when the opposition is relying on two things to prop up two sides of their case and they're in tension with each other, sometimes you can take out their whole case by explaining, well, if they can't prove these two things, they lose the debate in their own words, and one of these things isn't true because you can't have these two things at the same time, the whole thing crumbles. But a lot of the time it's where they're trying to double claim on benefits. They'll be able to claim, oh, we're being more caring, therefore we get X outcome, and B, we're being more retributive, therefore we're getting this outcome. If you call them on the fact that there's a tension there, it forces them to choose one way or the other. So they can't double claim on those benefits, and it brings them down. The last thing I'll say here is sometimes rebuttal is more of an art than a science. So figuring out where the framing and phrasing of the opposition is manipulative, or phrases things in a way that is unfair when you actually interrogate the assumptions, often has a lot of impact on how judges will weigh that analysis. So don't only focus on the minute point-by-point, logic-by-logic framing of the way they've responded or the way they've set it up their points. Make sure you're looking at the overall slant of their points, and if you say, hey, all of their responses have been in one direction because they're trying to only get you to focus on that, and there's all this other stuff that is important, you want to boost that up. And that's what comes in the third section of your issue and clash point. So if you have what we told you, you have how they responded and your responses within that, you then need to re-bolster your material and explain the end outcomes. So I tend to do this in two sentences. I'll say, we proved X, so I'll reaffirm the mechanism. After all of the stuff we've just discussed, what you should take away from it is that we proved X, and then an impact. So why it matters is X. And that is exactly what we were talking about with the substantive point, in making sure that the point is well impacted and explained why it matters, as well as just explaining how big it is or proving the mechanisms themselves, because that makes sure that it's balanced. You can't be outflanked on any of the broader issues. So these are all of the broader, like the usual points that people like to discuss when talking about debating. You have your clash points, you have your substantive, and you have your explicit rebuttal material. I want to talk about two more types of points that are I find particularly useful in either a first response, so first neg or second af, or just the seconds in general. And I call these foundation points, so figuring out some of shaping basically the foundations of the debate one way or another, making sure you do that meta debating but do it very clearly, and you're able to justify the assumptions that you're making within the debate. I think it's very important for a second speaker to be able to do this. And also extension material. So if you have within your issues or within your clashes particular goals that you want, and you have a couple of mechanisms towards getting it. Extension material is often about adding an extra mechanism or adding an extra reason that is basically new substantive material, but still fits within the framework of what is already discussed within a debate. Of course, if you're bringing extension material that entirely fits out of the context of what you've already been talking about, and I don't think it's that advisable as a second speaker to be doing that in general, but that's just my personal preference, then you just follow the traditional substantive framework that we talked about before. This extension style making of a point is particularly when you want to add to something that's already within the debate. So the foundation points are something that I worked a lot on at Australs, because at Australs what you'll tend to happen is a big shifting and a big contest, not just over the points themselves, but of the whole meta of the debate. What direction should the debate be going in? What are the common assumptions about it? So when I'm setting up my second speeches, I'll have my issues as the second 2/3 of my speech, but the first third will be clarifying 3 things within the debate that are important to stop the debate from becoming messy or to stop the opposition taking advantage or manipulating the foundations of the debate to make it easier for them to win. And the 3 things that I think are important to cover in a foundation point is firstly the context. So normally that is it's basically like a big rebuttal point that is very relevant for a lot of the stuff that has been told to you by the opposition, but doesn't seem to fit within any of the particular issues. And say, for example, you're talking about a Southeast Asia debate again, and the affirming team stands up and give the whole debate without any mention of China. And you're just like, well, China isn't just relevant to how each point operates, but it's relevant to how the whole debate works. What you'll want to do in your foundation section is have a very brief tagging of the fact that that bit of analysis is really important to how the whole point flows. So you'd be like, what they've missed about the context of this debate is that any debate about Southeast Asia is heavily dominated by the reactions of China, and failing to talk about China will necessarily have consequences for them proving this outcome, this outcome, this outcome. It's not necessarily about making that point, but it means when the judge is trying to assess what impact you had on the debate, they can just be like, oh, I remember they brought to me the importance of China, and then they explained it to me through all the points. So first thing, context. It's a big thing that they've missed within the debate that you think affects a lot of the debate. The second is what I like to sometimes call framework, but I think is more accurately described as a smackdown of irrelevant material. And what that's actually doing is it's not just about explaining why, well, it's not just saying, oh, I don't think the material is relevant, it's tying back to the idea of frameworks that we talked about in the first 2 sessions. Because normally what you're doing when you're saying that a point isn't relevant is you're comparing the 2 frameworks that the teams are offering within a debate. And remember, a team doesn't explicitly have to say, our framework in this debate, or our win conditions, or the priorities that we think are important within this debate are X, Y, and Z. They don't have to say that to have a competing framework. Often it's implicit. So the judge will be imposing something based on the content of their points. And when you're responding within this foundation section, it's essentially saying they brought you X point, but they can spend all the time they want proving X point. It is not important because of this framework that we have given to you is more reasonable, more valid, more important than the framework that has been given you by the opposition. So making your win conditions very clear, making the pathway to victory that you have very clear within that framework's point is a good way at the beginning of your speech just to put it on a clear direction and make sure that the rest of your material flows from that. And then the last thing I do that I think is important to clean up in a foundations point is just the comparative. Because very often, I think both at the very high level of debating and at the very low level of debating, you'll have teams that are arguing about slightly different things. And at the low level of debating, it's often just because they've missed the clash. They've misunderstood what the model from the opposition was. And so one team thinks they're arguing for this thing, one team thinks they're arguing for this thing. And at a very high level, it's often about both teams recognizing that shifting the comparative in one way or the other might give them an advantage in a very close debate. So that becomes a more conscious process. So what I like to do with my foundation points is just make it a very explicit, conscious process. To be very clear, adjudicator, what we are comparing is this and this, not this other thing that the opposition is trying to make the debate about. So once again, ground the debate very clearly in what it needs to operate and set up, and if you are the team that does that clearly and reasonably, and at the beginning of your speech, without trying to like slip it in by disguise, the judge is more likely to go along with your version of that point. So that's how I like to set up foundation points, particularly relevant for second speakers, but also for first speakers who are trying to set up the debate. Okay. So can you please give examples of foundations points? So that's broadly what I've just walked through there. It's not necessarily a particular type of the point. It's basically everything. If you're a first speaker, you have like a setup of the debate. It's essentially as a second speaker or as a first neg speaker, clearly asserting that setup of the debate in a very conscious way and making sure each of those like quite headline things are dealt with in order to make sure that the rest of the debate doesn't go off in any direction. And often, like, my foundation point will only be the comparative, because that's the only thing that the meta debate is arguing about, or it'll only be the framework because we agree about what we're comparing, but we about how we should shift it in terms of the frameworks we're setting up. So it's a very flexible point, but it's good to have at the beginning of your speech just to make it clear to the adjudicator what the grounds that you're having the debate on. So another question is, what is the best way to make your mechanism strong and clear? So I would say two things. Firstly, make sure that you walk through each logical link of your analysis. So make sure that, firstly, your assertions are justified, your assumptions. Be like, and that's in your context session. So often your mechanism, the strength of your mechanism will flow on from how clear your context section is, because that's setting out the assumptions that you have. So starting at the assumptions, then going forward to like each little link to say like, I think that this is the consequence of this because of how this flows out. You always need to have those becauses. And what I would add is also it's important to be quite granular. And by that, I don't just mean be very specific. I mean, try and tell the story in words that are understandable in like a human way. So not just saying we think that beneficiaries need extra money because of X, Y, Z and statistics and blah 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 blah. It's going through how this impacts a particular person from which the adjudicator can then abstract to all of the other persons. So adding in within your logical links, not just the like clear logic of it, but also the storytelling aspect, giving it a human face. And then the last thing I'd say is mechanisms are stronger when they have lots of even ifs. So when you're going through your mechanism, ask yourself, okay, if I don't win this particular part of the point, what happens to the rest of the point? Sometimes it'll be like, ooh, if I lose this part of the point, they win this point, so I need to spend more time winning this particular part, so it helps you prioritize there. But sometimes you can make your job a lot easier by just pointing out how even if you win one of the 9 like little bits of logic that you've been able to prove, the point will still hold because they're not like one long chain. They're actually lots of things feeding into the same thing. That means the judge, when they have a lot of rebuttal from the opposition, isn't just like, well, I think they've disproven one thing, therefore they're able to disprove this whole point. Rather, they think about each point as an individual value and making it clear the difference between points that are dependent or logical links that are dependent on each other and logical links that are independent from each other. So they contribute to the point, and even if they beat one, you're still able to prove this point, rather than if it's like a chain of logic, and if they defeat one of the chains, then you can't get that logical outcome. And then, of course, sometimes some logical links will kind of be like in the middle, so the explanation needs to be like, if they're able to prove this, it might not be able to be as strong a point, but it's still able to function because of this reason, this reason, this reason, and this reason. So yeah, make sure you have those even ifs, you're walking through all those alternatives, and that'll make your analysis much stronger in the long term. Okay, neat. Last point we're going to be talking about, broader point structure, I call extension points. And I know some third speakers who do this who should not be doing this because they should be constraining themselves strongly within the issues and clashes that we're talking about to make sure that the rebuttal is most usefully pointed towards the material that's going to be credited by the judge. And so this is particularly, once again, relevant for second speakers, who, as we know, are the best speaker position, and so I want to spend the most time talking about them. So when you're making a internal extension point, as opposed to the external extension points, which are like basically a substantive point, so you can just follow the substantive structure, what you have to keep in mind is often you don't have the same amount of time and you have already a lot of the work done for you. So it's about being very efficient in how you add this new mechanism or add this new argument that you think contributes to achieving one of those goals. And often this comes, so if I have my issues and clashes as a second speaker, remember I told you, what did we tell you? How did they respond? And then I get onto the mechanism and impact. Often I'll add the extension between how did they respond and then what if we, like, what is the outcome of this point? So being like, all of their responses fail for these reasons, and in fact, I'm going to add a mechanism, that's the mechanism of X, I'm going to deal with that now. And then at the end being like, so we have proved this material, and I've added this material, therefore we definitely have a huge impact within this debate. So when I'm setting up an extension point, the form sometimes will differ because it depends on linking into the material that has come before you. And the more times you can say, as my first speaker said, or as is clear from the debate, X thing, the less time you'll have to re-explain that analysis, because especially at second, you need to be very efficient. You don't want to be remaking material. So the way I set it up, an extension rather than a substantive, I tend to cramp that mechanism and context very briefly in the beginning of the point to make sure that I've got then room later within the point to shift it to fill in the gaps that are necessary. So I'll tend to have one sentence, but two clauses. I'll say, we know X, we know one bit of context, and I can go back and fill it in if I need to later in the point. We know X, therefore Y, and therefore Y is just the mechanism. Therefore, we're going to see this outcome when we do this particular thing. And then if I need to spend more time on that one, I'll go and fill it in. So you set it out very clearly at the beginning of your extension point so that the judge has a very clear image of it in their mind, and then you can then use it as your springboard to jump into which bit needs a little bit more expansion. So after that, after I've made sure that I've done the filling in work that I need to do on the context, and I've done the filling in work that I need to do on the mechanism, you go into the impact. And I think impacts are particularly important for extension material, because so often a judge will turn around and be like, I didn't think this point was particularly relevant, even if it was really well made and very compelling and very clear, I just didn't know how to fit it into the rest of the debate. So make it very clear what your extension material is adding, and note, if you are unable to figure out why your extension point matters, it does not matter, and it shouldn't be within your speech. So you need to hold yourself to a very high standard of not just running things that you think are interesting, not just running a novel split point for the hell of it. You need to run points that are meaningful within the debate, and you need to be able to explain why they're meaningful. And sometimes when I'm like, wow, this point is really interesting, I really want to make it, I can't figure out why it's useful, I'll turn to my first and third speaker and be like, okay, I'm going to write this point. You need to tell me why it is useful. And then because they're excellent and in tune with my feelings, they'll jump to it and give me like a beautiful explanation of why it's important that I can slot very naturally into my impact, but you need to make sure you're doing that at least at some point and lean on the team. So remember, not just thinking about impact in terms of how big something is, like how many people it affects, what is the quantity of the outcome, but also the quality. How does this point help me win the debate? Make sure you have those two layers to your impacting analysis, or they'll be able to outflank you either by claiming the effect that you've proved is very, very small, or by claiming that the effect you proved isn't relevant to the debate. Okay, neat. So that is that I broadly wanted to cover in terms of how you structure individual points. So I'll be online for another 10-ish minutes. So if you want to flick through any individual questions in the comment section or use the anonymous form, just flick them through now, and we'll have a chat. And chats are lovely. I'm gonna have a sip of my tea. I'll have a think about what other gems. Oh, my flat today, we have a broken blender problem. And so we melted some plastic off of a yogurt bucket. Joe is like shrinking as I tell this story. We melted it in a tinfoil frying pan concoction because we were going to pour it into the blender in order to repair the blender. We eventually decided against doing this, but the plastic that we ended up making was very, very cool. Because we were like, no, it's a dumb idea, we're just going to use super glue. Yeah. Cool. Any last questions before we sign off? Who is your favorite exec member? Probably Shar from last year. Just outstanding. Just phenomenal. Favorite ever? Probably Kayla. She was a great president. Favorite in the current exec? That is difficult. I'm a big fan of Celine. And also Amber and Aisha, who are phenomenal, especially because they ask questions. Neat. Any last questions before I say farewell? Check the form. Nope, beautiful. I hope you enjoyed that. Oh. I'm going to be SGM'd. So this may be the final the final stream, because Umber is threatening to SGM me. Can Grace and Joe make an appearance? Well, there's Joe.
And there's Grace. She's zooming over.
Neat. Sorry about the technical mishap. Lovely to see you all. Farewell.